you on the West Coast. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on this very important conversation that we're going to be having. I wanted to start off by just taking a few quick moments to talk about the events of the past few days and talk about why this conversation is so important right now. We had originally intended this conversation to be primarily focused around COVID-19 and the increase in gun sales that we've seen and the role that gun owners need to play in really educating and policing our own in terms of new gun owners. But what we have seen develop over the past week really is that not only do gun owners need to be open about the role of responsibility and safe storage, we also need to be open about policing our own in terms of issues of white supremacy and addressing head on the fact that if we are silent in how gun culture has far too often been co-opted by white supremacists, we're also complicit in that regard. So there's going to be leaning into some hard conversations here today. And I am incredibly grateful for the panelists for joining me. I'm Kyleanne Hunter, Vice President of Programs for Brady, and a longtime gun owner and lifelong sports shooter. We're really here to dig in today with this fantastic panel to talk about why gun owners need to be vocal in gun violence prevention. If we are not fully engaged and fully digging into this conversation, then we're missing out. And again, we're complicit in the violence that we see happening far too often. I've got a great panel that I'm going to introduce to you today. And just in terms of some mechanics, what you can do, I'm going to run through a few questions with these panelists. But please put your questions in the Q&A if you're with us on Zoom, or under the Facebook Live if you're joining us via Facebook. And we'll get to those questions in probably about 25, 30 minutes. We know this is a hard topic, and we really welcome and want you to be engaged with this. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce my panelists quickly. First, I have Representative Mike Thompson with me here, who represents California's 5th Congressional District, which is Napa, Contra Costa County, Lake, Solano, and Sonoma County. Beautiful part of the world, but also right now gearing up for some fire season. So we're hoping for the best of him out there. Before he was voted into Congress, he represented California's 2nd District in the California State Senate, where he was part of the Budget Committee. When he was elected in 1990, he was the first Vietnam veteran elected to the California State Senate. He served in combat with the U.S. Army as a staff sergeant and platoon leader with the 173rd Airborne, where he was wounded and received a Purple Heart. He was also instructor in the Army's Airborne School, and in the wake of the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, he was named chairman of the House's Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, which is an incredibly important organization that we have in the House of Representatives. He himself is a hunter, gun owner, and strong supporter of the Second Amendment, yet believes that Congress needs to be doing more to reduce gun violence. In February of 2013, the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force released a comprehensive set of policy principles to reduce gun violence while respecting the Second Amendment, including expanding the criminal background check system to all commercial firearm sales. So thank you, Rep. Thompson, for being with us today. Next, I've got Mark House, who is the principal of Bronx Engineering and Technology Academy in New York City and the chair of Brady's New York Regional Leadership Council. Prior to moving to New York, Mark lived and worked in both Virginia and Maryland. He grew up just up the road from us here in Frederick, Maryland, and is a lifelong hunter and target shooter. In New York City, he continues to pursue this passion as a member of a local gun range. He believes very strongly in stopping gun violence and often speaks about the intersection of his work as a principal and keeping students safe, and his love of being a father and trying to keep his own kids safe, as well as his lifelong hobby and passion that involves firearms. It is this intersection that brought him to Brady, along with his friend Josh Solomon, who's another RLC member. He lives in Harlem along with his wife and daughter. Thank you, Mark, for being with us. And finally, we are joined by Kayla Hicks, who is a senior advisor to Executive Director Josh Horowitz at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Kayla has served as a state organizer for Virginians for Responsible Gun Laws and currently leads the Virginia Action Network. In her position, she is responsible for the organization's outreach to impacted communities that are disproportionately affected by gun violence. These communities are also historically underrepresented in the debates on this issue and often brushed aside by their elected officials. Kayla seeks to engage these unserved and underserved communities through free workshops that provide the tools necessary to enact real change. Kayla brings more than 25 years of experience organizing diverse groups, union and labor groups, workforce groups, grassroots efforts, elections, and campaigns in more than 15 states. As a gun owner herself, Kayla has a particular interest in responsible firearm ownership. She has a passion for helping others and volunteers as a victim assistance advocate in Virginia. She's dedicated to community service and resides in Virginia, where her husband serves as a law enforcement officer. So thank you. As you can see, we have a very diverse group of not only backgrounds, but experiences with guns here. And that's really where I want to start, because to have this conversation and to have it in an open and honest way, we need to start with how we came to guns and gun ownership, because far too often it's seen as just a binary. You're a gun owner or you're not a gun owner. But how much guns are a part of your life and part of your identity are really important. So Rep. Thompson, I'd like to start with you. What is your background and history with guns?
Well, I think you hit on most of it. I guess, to your basic lifelong gun owner. I've had, you might say, an infatuation with guns since I was a little boy. I've told the story before. I can remember my dad taking a rifle, deer rifle that he had at the time we had gun racks. They hang on the wall in one room, and the guns would be on there. I remember him taking it off and walking through the house with the rifle and me in tow, and my mom saying, "Where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to go break him of his infatuation with guns." We drove up to his father's property, and he got out of the truck and loaded this rifle, handed it to me. It was so heavy. I was so little and it was so heavy that I couldn't hold it up. He had to hold the gun and support it. And he said, "Shoot that post." And I shot, and my immediate response was, "Let's do it again." And he said, "Back in the truck." And we went home and walked in the house, and my mother said, "Well," and he said, "It didn't work." So for whatever reason, I've always liked guns. I've always had guns as long as I've been an adult, and I do to this day. As you pointed out, I'm a hunter. I target shoot, and I believe strongly in the Second Amendment. We have a right to own firearms, but also with that right comes a responsibility. And I think you hit on that. As gun owners, I think we really need to step up and to insist that gun owners exercise that responsibility to ensure that everyone who owns a gun does it responsibly, uses it responsibly. That ties right in with your safe storage issue that you're going to talk about today. And I would just caution people that as gun owners, we know more about what to do to fix the problems associated with this issue than somebody who has no experience with a gun. And gun owners are dropping every day, and the number of non-gun owners continues to grow. So if we don't fix these problems, at some point we hit a tipping point, and I don't want people that don't know about guns, quote unquote, fixing the problem, because our plight will be worse.
Thank you. Kayla, you had a very different experience with coming to own guns. So can you talk a little bit about yours?
Sure. My experience and introduction to guns came about when I began working as a bounty hunter and retired bounty hunter, and as a private investigator, which I still am. I would often carry concealed. Kai, as you know, I've not had a love of guns. that has not been my situation, but I certainly love being a responsible gun owner. And being a woman of color, knowing that gun ownership has a different meaning for me than it does for all of you, has always been my priority. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot of the conversation throughout this webinar. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Kayla. And Mark, how about you? What was your sort of history and background with guns?
Sure, mine's probably a little bit closer to Mike's in terms of, you know, as a young kid, always thinking that they were fantastic. I don't know when I got my first BB gun. I was probably too young. If my mom's watching this, sorry, Mom. And it's always been something that's been a passion and an interest from hunting, growing up with them, target shooting, all the way through. And being a New York City resident, being a gun owner is not something that doesn't go without a lot of hurdles to go through, and probably rightfully so, but getting them registered and making sure that you've passed all the background checks, even having your spouse sign off that they're okay with them in the house. So it's definitely something that's of enough interest to me that it is a pretty big part of my life in terms of going target shooting, hunting, and being a responsible gun owner.
Thank you. You know, I think this notion of responsible gun owner keeps coming up. So I want to dig into that a little bit. And Kayla and Rep Thompson, both of you had guns as part of your professional life. You know, guns were a part of, whether it was, you know, as a bounty hunter and private investigator needing or wanting a concealed carry, wanting or needing that way, as well as, you know, Rep Thompson, your time in the Army, being around guns. How did your professional association with guns shape what you think of responsibility, or did it at all? And Kayla, we can start with you.
How did me being a gun owner get shaped by my professional experience? I don't think that I ever thought about it that way. Me coming into this movement taught me more about the responsibility, about the safety of it, because prior to being introduced to this movement by Lori Hosh and Josh Horowitz, I would keep firearms in the nightstand, or it wasn't, you know, there's no small children in my home. So there was never any concern for me to keep it safely locked up. You know, I don't think I had an impact in that way. I know that I've been more conscious lately in this movement to understand that there are more Black gun owners increasing the ownership of firearms and desperately wanting, especially Black women, wanting to own to protect their families. So I think that for me, there was no influence professionally. It just was, I have a gun and it's safe according to what I think safety is. And then I learned along the way what that meant. And so now I practice, you know, being very safe and responsible with my firearms.
Well, Josh and Lori are probably two of the best teachers
They are.
In this movement too. Absolutely.
They are.
Like, just in terms of bringing in responsibility and to the conversation. And Rep Thompson, how about you with regards to your professional background? Did it play a role at all?
Well, I certainly had more exposure to firearms than in my military time, different types of firearms. I learned how to and used firearms far different than the ones I used as a kid growing up or as an adult now. And I think I was able to experience the absolute awesome capabilities of some of these weapons. I can tell you, when I got back from Vietnam, I didn't touch a gun. I didn't hunt. I didn't target shoot for a number of years. It took me a while to get back into it. And I certainly know what the capabilities are of weapons that are made for combat, and how incongruent they are with our needs as hunters, as personal protection weapons, as some sort of household protection weapon. And I think at that time is that experience has really helped me balance my thoughts in this whole debate.
Yeah, that, I think one of those things you hit just felt very true for me in my life, both in terms of the fact that, when I showed up for OCS, I had been around guns a long time, yet I think the care and dedication the Marine Corps took in ensuring that I knew inside and out the types of weapons I was going to be using, and most importantly, understood their purpose and that they existed to take life. And that was something that was never to be taken cavalierly at all, was a big, I think, just shaping point in how I frame the gun world. But I want to ask this question to you, Mark, in a slightly different way, because you have slightly different experiences, but I think ones that are really important for this conversation is how your professional and personal life, so still really your role as a principal, who is charged. One of the things that is often sort of top of people's minds when they think about gun violence in this country, those who aren't really engaged in the movement, is school shooting. That's something that, even though there are a very small minority of actual deaths, and we'll get into that in a moment, there's something that's kind of top of the American consciousness. So how did your role as a principal, and your role as a father, shape how you think about storage and how you talk about it with other people, or responsibility, even beyond storage? This is a broader notion of responsibility. I think it's not just locking your guns up, it's really how you're interacting with them for the entirety of your time with them.
Yeah, I thank you. That's a lot to unpack. So I guess in terms of the professional side, one of the things that brought me to this conversation in the first place was getting really, really tired of hiding kids in classrooms and trying to figure out how to do lockdown drills. How do we, how do you take a group of sixth graders? I was working in a school that had a middle school too. So trying to explain to an 11-year-old in a way that makes sense, and sometimes being shocked that they understand it from their own life experience, that I need to protect you if somebody comes in the front door wielding a firearm that's capable of, all firearms are capable of lots of destruction. But somebody who's coming there to do ill to children. So that was part of what brings me to this conversation, part of my evolution in thinking, which is probably the best description for my relationship with guns, from being one of those folks that was far more cavalier than I should have been, to somebody who's far more cautious. And then you ask about my daughter. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and thinking about who's most likely to get hurt with the firearms I have in my house. And it's her and my wife. Probably followed by me. And lastly, somebody who's trying to do harm. So having a lot of conversations there, thinking about how I store them, thinking about how I lock them up, but also as a gun owner who does want to defend a home if need be, thinking about how I access them, and having both of those be a part of the conversation, right? So, and thinking about what makes the most sense in my context. But number one, protecting a beautiful 9-year-old innocent girl from her father's hobby. That's a huge part of what we do. I wouldn't for a second hesitate to put her in a car seat. I wouldn't for a second hesitate to make sure she's sitting in the back, that she's buckled up. The conversation my wife and I had about BPAs and plastics. What is she getting as a child? To have all those conversations about keeping your kids safe, and then to be cavalier and irresponsible on the gun ownership part just seems ridiculous. I know when she has friends come over, one of the conversations is around, do you own guns? How do you keep them stored? And usually I'm delighted that somebody asked the question, and take them and show them where they're stored, how we keep them. And then, they have an option on whether they want their kid to play in a household that has guns. But I think it's hugely important to ask that question. I don't want my kid playing in a household where there's a loose weapon around. It's not something, I don't think I'd be a responsible parent if I was letting her run around a household with an unsecured firearm.
Thanks. Yeah, this notion of, I think, being transparent and being willing to have that conversation is important, just to really be able to put a stake in the ground and sort of call out our own if things aren't going well. In which this is where I want to turn to, I think, sort of the beginning of some of these stuff. Not that any of these questions are easy, but start to dig into some of the, I think, harder questions and harder sort of self-truth here around what gun owners need to be doing as part of this conversation. And that is starting with the fact that we have seen in March, April, and then again in May, record numbers of background checks that are being performed, which leads us to have a very good conclusion that there is a very large number of gun sales that are going on. Anecdotally, we know that there are many of these people are first-time gun owners. And we know that, Kayla mentioned this, and we've seen this in some of the anecdotal stories as well, that Black women are more and more purchasing guns as a way of protection. We also know women in general are purchasing guns as way of protection. People who would not identify themselves as really sort of part of a gun owner group are purchasing guns. And with that comes risk. With that comes risk that comes from very much just what real ignorance is, lack of knowledge, lack of knowing just how to use the gun, how to clean it, how to take it apart, what it actually does. What we in the military refer to as negligent discharges are going to go way up when people don't actually know how to use these things. Lack of knowledge about storage, which is one of the things. What are you going to do with this gun when you're not around it? And also lack of knowledge about how you might be perceived by others around having a gun, and what that means, and what this notion of being cavalier around guns might turn out to be. So I want to really open this up to all of our panelists. We've seen this rise of gun sales. We know that people who haven't been around guns before are purchasing guns. We know that most of these are first-time gun owners who are in a situation where they're getting a gun without a lot of the normal conversations and support and one-on-one person-to-person interaction to learn how to be safe around them that might be seen. So what advice do you all have for some of these new gun owners? And Kayla, I'd like to start with you on this one, if you would. What, with this rise in gun owners, what advice do you have? And also what concerns you? What's your biggest concern coming out of this rise of gun ownership that we're seeing?
So there's quite a few things there. And if you don't mind, just for a moment, I want to go back to what Mark was sharing in regards to being a responsible parent and wanting to make sure that his daughter is safe. I must make sure that I share the same lens, but show you how different it is. So what we have in our Black and Brown communities is a different option. We would love to keep our children safe, and many of us are very responsible parents. However, it's very difficult for us when we don't have the option to keep our kids safe, because our kids can get guns more easily than they can get food, healthcare more easily than they can get the service that are necessary, just the bare necessities of life. So it's really important that we also put a lens and start to elevate the awareness around the root causes of gun violence, something that we consistently talk about at the Ed Fund, and have worked very closely with Christian Heine on this conversation. Is our homes don't always have options. We don't have that. So I think I want to make sure that I point that out, is that when you have a population of people that are stereotyped negatively and from every lens, it gets very difficult for us to be able to enjoy the same luxuries as others, to protect our children who are seen as criminals before they are seen as children. And then with that said, as you know, first-time gun owners and people that are wanting to own guns, in Virginia, it's a very different space. There's so many arguments and so many things that happen to distract from what is really the core conversation, and that is about saving lives. People get mixed up on what they believe is legal and what's not legal. So many folks believe that it is mandatory to get a background check, and they probably hear these comments from a loved one that don't they don't understand it themselves. But I would encourage them to do what I did. And what I did was I went above and beyond. None of this was required of me to do, but I went and I got training. I wanted to understand how to use this firearm, not only how to use it, how to retain this firearm, and not only how to retain this firearm, how to keep it safe. And there was so much that went into that that was not required. There is no proficiency that you need to show. So if the government is not going to keep you and your family safe by requiring that if you're going to be a gun owner, that you must show proficiency, then you keep your family safe on your own. There's no excuse for it. And responsible gun owners such as us on this webinar right now, it's our responsibility to lift up our voices and bring awareness to what should be just common sense. I mean, make it just like a driver's license. For crying out loud, we're not going to let you drive a car if you don't show us that you know how to use it. But hey, you can sure get that gun, because that makes sense, right? No, of course it doesn't. So I would just encourage people to get as much training as they can that is available to them, you know, and don't use excuses about that. If you want to own a gun and you're going to be responsible, don't think that this is back in the old day when you can say, hey, you know, kid, don't touch this gun because it's dangerous. Mommy and daddy says, don't touch it, and think that's going to work. It's not enough. You know, evolve. If you want something different, do something different.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important way to segue to Mark with some of this. If you want something different, do something different. Because I know you've changed some of your practices throughout your life. So how would you frame this with somebody who's a new gun owner?
Yeah, it's interesting. So living in New York, there aren't the same number of gun owners, you know, as growing up in Maryland or living in Virginia. And so when folks that I know are interested in purchasing guns, I'm frequently the person that they come talk to. So I just walked somebody through this, you know, 2 weeks ago, who is interested in purchasing a gun. And I said, first question is, what do you want it for? Right? Let's think through that. Do you want it as something to take to the range? Do you want it as something to defend your family? And he wanted it as something, you know, he's an African-American male and wanted it as something to defend himself and his family. I said, okay, that makes sense. Where are you going to keep it? Right, was the second set of questions. And I said, we need to make sure you've got enough money for a good safe, a good storage locker, a good space to keep it, you know, before you put your 2 teenage kids and your wife at risk with this thing. So we talked through it. We looked at different options. He ended up wanting one that he could access quickly because that was his purpose for purchasing it in the first place. And he got one with a biometric reader on it. You know, something where it's his fingerprint. He was able to access it quickly, but it kept his kids out of it. And then I think probably because my wife is a professor and deals in public health a great deal, I said, I think the last part we need to think through is under what circumstances would you want somebody taking this out of the house? So my wife and I have an agreement. If either of us start suffering from, you know, anything diagnosed as a mental illness, that especially me, since I'm the owner of it and she abhors the things to begin with, but that she'll remove it from the house. And she has permission to do that. If it's dementia, if it's depression, that gun, all the guns that I own, leave the house immediately. So just kind of talking a new gun owner through the process. Kayla makes a good point. We didn't get to the training part of it, and we should. I'll go back and have that secondary conversation with them. But I think just slowly walking through somebody through that process and thinking about, why do you want it? Where are you going to keep it? Have you thought this whole process through before they just go up to the gun counter and make a purchase?
Yeah, walking through those steps is important. And Rep Thompson, you know, if you think about from back when you were first taken out to shoot a rifle, you know, to try to dissuade you from your love of guns, up through, you know, really seeing in Vietnam what they were and how they were used, and, you know, that power of life and death they had, to now your time, you know, as a continued hunter and sport shooter, is the way that you engage with new gun owners. You know, how do you use that sort of lifetime worth of experience to have what are sometimes really hard and uncomfortable situations?
Well, we also, I think, need to remember that I suspect we're going to see another bump in gun purchases, given what's going on right now. And so the more people that have guns and the more new gun owners that are out there, it exacerbates other problems we have. And that's home break-ins where people's guns are stolen and used in crime, or sold on the black market to be used in crime. So improper storage, improper use. Some states don't have the same requirements, as has already been said. It's pretty tough in California. You need to go through a number of hoops in order to legally purchase a gun in California. But some states, you need to be able to look over the counter in the gun store to be able to get one. And so I think we really need to be doing a much better job in educating people in regard to training them how to properly use a firearm, what sort of firearm. Mark said that somebody asked about for home protection. Well, I don't think you need an AR-15 in order to protect your home. There's, especially if you don't want the bullets to go through your window into the next door neighbor's house. So there's proper firearms to have for proper uses, and we need to be able to explain that to people. I'm very, very fortunate. I was taught about guns from a very young age. I know that I took the hunter safety course as a kid 3 times before I got my hunting license. And it wasn't because I didn't pass the first 2 times, but the first 2 times I was too young to have a hunting license. But it was a summertime activity. You could take the course, you could see movies about proper gun use. You got a box of 22 shells. They took you to the range. It was something you were able to do. I had a grandmother who used to tell me stories about when she lived on a ranch, how somebody put his hands over the barrel of his gun and the gun went off and shot a hole through both of his hands. I can tell you, I still think about that. You could not make me put my hands over the barrel of a gun. But people buying guns today, they don't have that background. They don't benefit from that type of experience. So we just need to do a much better job teaching and explaining to people those, not only those rights, but those responsibilities that come along with guns. And we could probably do, we could do a much better job, I believe, doing that.
Absolutely. And I think, we've been focusing a lot on the technical aspect of safety, which is a very real and very important one, especially when we're talking about things like ending family fire, the shooting involving a unsecured or misused gun that somebody finds in the home. People need to be very, very aware of the technical aspect of how to be responsible around guns. And that's absolutely, I think, all of our responsibilities. But I want to turn to something that goes beyond the technical right now, that especially in this moment, I think as the 4 of us saying we're responsible gun owners, we need to also be calling to task. And that is some of the undercurrent of privilege that exists in gun ownership in many ways and has been misused and co-opted by extremists. I think one of the most recent cases of just seeing this really in our face is in Michigan, where we had groups of armed protesters show up and essentially bully and intimidate the legislature away from actually doing their job. This is something that as a Marine who spent a lot of time fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this is exactly the behavior that in those countries, when we saw armed groups bullying elected legislators, intimidate them, threatening them with force for doing their job to go out and elect to represent their people, we referred to this as terrorist activity. We referred to these places as almost failed states. This was unacceptable behavior. And as a white gun owner, seeing white people do this in this country, using really hiding as cowards under the Second Amendment is what these folks are doing. They are they are abdicating their responsibility to this country. They are abdicating their responsibility to a functioning democracy. You know, as a Marine, this goes against, I think, everything that I swore an oath to defend, which is, you know, people's right to peacefully assemble and protest, but more importantly, the government's right to represent the people that it serves without intimidation and bullying by extremists that are there. So right now would like to spend just a few minutes, and I know it's a deep, contentious issue that we could probably spend the rest of the year unpacking here. But and I'm going to turn to Mark and Mike first before Kayla on this, because I think especially right now as white gun owners, we can't be silent in saying that the activity that goes and bullies state legislatures into not doing their job is acceptable. I mean, I think, you know, Mike, I got to speak for you. I think you kind of agree with me. Seeing these guys dressed up like they want to go play G.I. Joe is insulting to everyone who has actually given of themselves physically and emotionally to protect and defend this country. And so we need to be better. We need to be better to do the work to call out our own in this. And so I'm going to open it up to you both first, Mark and Mike. If either one of you have anything that you want to say around this on how we can be better to actually speak out against this, because being silent that this is acceptable behavior is being complicit in so much of what we're seeing going on right now. So whichever of you might want to talk.
Well, I'll go. I think it is incumbent upon all gun owners to be vocal about this. As I said before, if we don't police ourselves, we're going to suffer the consequences of somebody else doing it for us. And I don't think as gun owners, we're going to like the end result. So I think we need to speak out. I can tell you, my friends, that when I'm at the duck club or I'm out shooting clay targets, I can't tell you how many times people have said things like, well, you don't need a AK-47 or an AR-15 in order to do this stuff. And, you know, there's a lot of people who believe that responsible gun owners need to be responsible. And we just need to encourage people to talk about it and to take a stand. And I'm like you, I guess. I'm offended when I see these people dressing up in their fatigues that they bought at the Army surplus store and walking around with a gun on their hip or a gun over their shoulder. You know, if you feel that strongly about it, enlist, join the military. But you know, we just don't need that on our streets and at peaceful protests and at rallies or in downtown stores. I think it's ridiculous, and I think it puts us all at risk.
Yeah, I would agree. And this notion that, you know, walking around, you know, both this inherent privilege that is on display by these predominantly men walking around with their AR-15s is indicative of so much of what we're seeing is wrong right now. Mark, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I a lot of thoughts, but so I think grappling with a few things. One of them, how we possibly think that it's remotely acceptable for firearms to be near a legislative body in the first place, strikes me as absurd in the extreme. The secondary part of this is thinking about gun culture in America, and one, making sure that we're not, you know, painting with one large brush. But I think there's a lot of information out there that says any infringement upon any part of this is infringement against anybody and everybody around gun ownership. That's definitely part of the messaging that's out there. And I think what it does is it turns people into cowards. I think it makes them slow to speak up and say, this isn't me, this isn't what I believe, I'm not a part of that movement, I don't support them, I think it's absurd. And I think the more that folks can recognize that and say it and speak their truth and say, these folks don't represent me as a gun owner, I think that's going to be profoundly important. And then I was marching in Harlem on Saturday, and just watching the difference in the way people are treated based on the color of their skin as they assemble and as they protest and as they put pressure on governments. It certainly has to be a part of this conversation as well. That a bunch of peaceable folks on 125th Street were treated more poorly than a group of armed white gentlemen at a state capitol is absurd. And it's, I think to say anything else would be pandering. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, the stark differences shows, I think, some of the failures that have, some of the failures of leadership at the very top that we have right now, of who are being called very fine people, and who are getting, bullied. And so Kayla, I know yesterday we spoke a little bit about gun culture, and it's something Mark brought up. And I think you made some incredibly astute and I think important concepts for our listeners right now to really engage with around, where some of just even the term gun culture holds privilege that folks might not even be thinking about. So if you're willing to share in that regard, I think it's a really important part of this conversation right now.
Sure. And I was writing down as each one of you were talking, because there was a lot that I was thinking that I need to follow up on so that I better understand some things. But, definitely when I heard you use the term terrorist activity, I would love to know what would be the end result if you all said this is terrorist activity, like what happens. And then when Mark just mentioned that, these are cowards, right? And I know these are cowardly people myself, but, I want to know what happens to these cowards, because when they're Black, they become criminals like magic. It happens just like that. Like there's I'm kind of stuck there. So not putting anyone on the, I don't expect you to answer right now, but the ideal is that, what's happening, like what's being done different in these spaces. And when we talk gun culture, as you and we spoke yesterday, talking about gun culture to me is very different, because all I know, and no offense, but for me, gun culture is about white men. Like there's nothing beyond that for me. I mean, what else is there to me? Because my upbringing and listening to the Rep Thompson talk, it was like, I remember just learning that the gun is the white man's master and the Black man's disaster. That's very different from what all of you are sharing with me. It's like I was in a space to always remember that, just be prepared to know that there is going to be someone that might be afraid of you. And this at that time was more about Black males. And as it's, we still hear a lot about that now, but I was just taught that, it wasn't referred to me as stand your ground. It was like, if a white person's afraid of you, then you could potentially die. I have 3 adult sons, and that's real for me. This is beyond a conversation about responsible gun ownership. This conversation is so deeply rooted in lessons, right? You have to look at mistakes, and then I mentioned this morning, cross that word out and talk about lessons. And look at what's happening with the police. Everyone that knows me knows that I work very closely with law enforcement, especially the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, because it's so key, it's essential. But look at what's happening, where you have some bad police officers, law enforcement officers doing bad things. But who's paying for that? All law enforcement. You can't tell good from bad anymore, because people's anger is so deep that it doesn't matter if you're a Black officer. It doesn't matter if you're a good white officer. If you're an officer, you are being put into one barrel and you are all seen as the same. And that is a lesson that gun owners should learn, because I hear people often talk about the race war that's coming and the blood that's going to be shed. We can do something about that. And I think it's going to really require for responsible white gun owners to take the lead on this. You know, before there is a riot or a rally, can you all show up? Can you show up in front of your legislators? What do legislators that I know of fear the most, in my experience in my life, is losing their support, whether that be their financial support, whether that be their constituents. That support is important. And when you have good legislators such as Rep. Thompson on the webinar, you know, we rally behind those legislators and we show up before. And so we know Black people are going to show up. Black women are always going to show up, like, you know, Black girl magic. It's real. It's not like a myth. We're real. Like, we're going to vote. So we're going to make the difference. We're always going to be there, but we need people to be there for us now. And we hear lots of conversations about all of the awfulness that is happening to Black males. But, you know, it's part of my responsibility to elevate and build capacity and bring awareness to the Black woman's voice. You know, we have a voice in all of this, and we are always either seen as the help or hidden figures, and that can't be tolerated any longer. We need to be on the front lines in this space too. Black gun owners are typically seen as Black gun users, not responsible gun owners. And there are lots of Black national and local gun clubs and groups. There are hunters, sportsmen. There's so many that, you know, we don't talk about it, but you all are, have this military background, so you know this better than I do. The majority of my friends that are in the military, they build their own firearms. They're making their own weapons. They're not buying them, they're building them. They're just as capable as anyone else. I don't want to wait until we have to address a race war to decide, well, what are we going to do about it, when we can start doing something about it right now. And this is a beginning, so I really applaud you all for doing this.
Yeah, no, and thank you. And I think that this is why at this moment where there's a lot of there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of sound bites that are flying around as a result, being able to have these real conversations among people, even though we can't be together, we're still together having them, is one of the biggest parts. To be able to hold, you know, both to say this is unacceptable, and I would go to, I'm not law enforcement, but would go to criminal for much of the behavior that we are seeing with around the intimidation of legislators that is there to say it's not right, but also to uplift and bridge these divides, to highlight the importance of Black gun owners, not just users, in this, and to, you know, the work that Rep. Thompson is doing through the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force to address a lot of these issues of systemic change that needs to happen with regards to how guns are accessible, who's held responsible. You know, this notion of that Kayla brought up, where it's often easier to get access to a gun than education in some communities, moving that responsibility upstream to the dealers that are profiting off of that, rather than going after individuals so that communities can heal. You know, these are important parts of the conversation. And I wish we had like 2 more hours to keep going on this, but did want to hit a few audience questions, because I think they are important conversations. And one of them, again, goes back, I know we've moved away from some of the technical side of this, but do actually want to hit on this one technical question in particular, which is around the idea that if you need if you believe you need a gun for protection, that storing it responsibly, safely, you know, basically storing it locked, is going to negate your ability to actually hold that job. I know, Mark, I'm going to go to Mark first with this one, because I know you actually have a real story on this that you've told in our podcast, which I encourage folks to go listen to. But can you start answering that one, Mark, and then I'm going to circle back a little bit more on it.
Sure. I live in an apartment, and I was having dinner with my daughter one night, and somebody was trying to kick down our door. And if anybody's ever had that experience, it's insanely scary. So I grabbed her and we moved towards the back bedroom. And again, I keep my firearms that I'm going to access for self-defense in a biometric safe. And I would say accessing that firearm probably took me an extra 3 seconds to get it out of there, to get it up, to get it ready, and to start yelling, get away, get away, get away, get away. I have a gun, get away. You know, luckily they didn't manage, it's a steel door, and they didn't manage to get all the way through, and whether they had the wrong apartment or, you know, were dealing with some mental health or substance abuse, I thank God that they didn't come through the door. But the having it locked up properly where nobody else could get to it but me, like I say, maybe an extra 3 seconds. And I've replayed that in my head a number of times. I think there's absolutely a way to have your firearm stored safely and still accessible.
That's great. Rep. Thompson or Kayla, any thoughts on that one?
I agree. I think it's just the responsibility of all responsible gun owners to secure their firearms, and you can do it in a way that's not going to be a disadvantage to you. I have a gun safe. All my guns are locked in a safe. I have a son that's a cop. All his guns are locked in a safe. I don't see where this is a problem. If you have to, if you feel you have to have a firearm at the ready at a certain time of the day, take it out of the safe. And I think Mark's story is spot on.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And I think I'm going to break my moderator role for a moment, because this is one of the things that I get very passionate about. I think it also, though, speaks to the importance of actually understanding what guns are and what you are saying that you are okay doing. If you're saying that that gun is to protect your family, because what you're also doing is taking the responsibility to take another human life. And that's one of those conversations, decisions, thought processes that can't be taken lightly. It can't be taken cavalierly. One of the things I think that has contributed to so many of the privilege and bias issues that we see in this country right now is that there are groups out there who have framed getting a gun as the antidote to anything that might be scary in your life. And they have used this to, you know, bait racial inequalities. We've seen this in, like, even the response to COVID. I mean, an organization that's essentially saying, like, buy guns because COVID is scary. I mean, that's what you're not going to shoot a virus. Like but it creates this cavalier attitude that you just, if you add more guns, it's going to make you safe. And, you know, I think I've been in plenty of situations where more guns definitely did not make anybody safe, given what we're seeing overseas. So I think that's also incumbent on us. So I think that actually is an important caveat to another listener question that has percolated in a few different forms. So I'm going to paraphrase a whole bunch of people's questions together to really say more of, like, what do you think is keeping gun owners from being vocal in calling each other out, and in sort of putting a line and saying this behavior is unacceptable, and sort of giving an outside voice to the folks, as Mark said, that are cowards, that are hiding behind this shroud of the Second Amendment. And Rep. Thompson, I want to start with you on this one.
Well, that's a question we've been grappling with for a long time. As you point out, the bill that I wrote came out of the task force to require background checks for anybody who buys a firearm. Pretty straightforward. The whole idea is to make sure that someone who is a danger to themselves or other, someone who's dangerously mentally ill, someone who's a criminal, just make it tougher for them to get a gun. And it's something that is supported by over 90% of the American people. I had that bill, or a form of that bill, for 7 years before we got it passed out of the House. Now it's been sitting over in the Senate since the Democrats took over the House. So it's been there for almost 2 years. And the head of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, won't take it up. And he won't take it up because of this political barrier that it's the camel's nose under the tent. If you do one thing, you're going to do another. And it's a tough one to break. And sadly, I think it's It's going to have to be broken with political force. They have to elect the requisite number of votes in the Senate to make sure that we get common sense legislation that we know will save lives, passed and signed into law. We see it every day. You know, anytime a Democrat is elected to the White House, or in some states to the governor's house, immediately gun sales go up because the gun market.
Oh, we just.
That Democrats are coming to take your guns, and that's just not the case. And the evidence is pretty clear in that regard. So they've been so effective that you can't pass a background check bill. You can't pass a bill prohibiting bump stocks, an aftermarket device that you could put on a rifle to make it operate identical to an illegal rifle. And it's just ridiculous. And I think that responsible gun owners are the ones that need to change that. We need to point out how foolish that is and how we need to be passing these laws and taking these actions to keep all of us safe.
Absolutely. Kayla, any thoughts on what's stopping folks from actually speaking out?
Yeah, I want to first, because I'm so Kayla, I'm going to first go back and say thank you for breaking your moderator role, because showing up authentic is so important. And you said that there was a push to buy guns because COVID is scary. So I, in my so Kayla moment, want to say I think it was more or less buy guns because it's scaring us that Black people are scary, because people are thinking, oh, Black people are going to now really come hurt us, rob us, steal something from us, do something to us. There's always this underlying conversation that we don't want to bring to the top, because it just seems like, we're criticizing all people. We're not. We're just saying, please be aware that it's not COVID that's scaring you to buy guns. You're afraid that someone's going to try to come and steal what you have. Maybe because people that have money can afford to go clear out the stores and take all the essentials like toilet paper and all that great stuff. And the people that are vulnerable and can only shop once or twice a month, they have to wait to get it. So they might think, oh, they're going to come take it from us. Yeah, I don't think that's what's happening. And I think at some point, acknowledging that the biggest issue we're dealing with is police violence, being gun violence, and how that has to be discussed in real terms. But I will tell you what stops me, what had stopped me as a gun owner from coming into this space, because it was about language and attitude and beliefs and behaviors. Like, your personality cannot be an excuse for bad behavior. And many people in the movement for gun violence prevention are wanting to save lives, or have a voice, did it in a way where it would be very disrespectful and rude. I had for years, people would come to me and with fingers pointing, and people that know me, I'm not that's not me. Like, don't do that. But it's disrespectful to tell someone that's a gun owner and that's responsible, why do you have a gun? What do you need it for? Guns in the home don't make you safer. And then start drilling into me what I already know, to tell me that I'm not doing something right. And that in itself pulled me away from having conversations. So I think the way we approach this sometimes, and even to this day, there are still some people that have that approach with me, where it's like, why do you need it? At some point, you want to get to a place to say, it's none of your business why I need it. But if you want to share, I think we have to learn how to share better. We have to do that listening better, like people hear, but try to listen to what responsible gun owners are saying. And I think that collectively, developing one safe space for gun owners to come and not feel like they have to defend why they own firearms, or to be made feel like they are less than responsible because someone else's perception of what they do is not good enough. I think providing a safe space for gun owners to not have to be defensive for every conversation that's had, because it's just unfortunate, but a harsh reality that even for me, for as wise as I am in this space, I'm not going to listen to someone that's pointing a finger at me or that's using language that makes, it feels like they're accusing me of being part of the problem. It's about opportunities right now and how we want to present them. So I think it's presentation really and language.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that hit on a lot that's important, but really that sense of, when well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals come at gun owners in a very accusatory way, I think it undermines a little what Rep. Thompson said at the beginning, that to solve the problem, we really need to be, we need to be engaged. So Mark, your thoughts, where can, what's really inhibiting? I mean, you clearly aren't inhibited in speaking out and actually lead our RLC. But what, where do you see some of the stumbling blocks?
I think Kayla said it well. I think one, I haven't always been comfortable speaking out. I think if you are a gun owner or immersed in reading about guns, et cetera, you get bombarded with the messages. Like Mike said, what was the camel's nose under the tent? That is their primary talking point, right? So, if we give up one little tiny piece of this, we're giving up everything. So that message gets bombarded a lot. And then I think about the gun range where I go in New York City, that's minority owned. It's got a diverse group of folks that belong to it. It's probably as much a social club as anything. But the folks there aren't interested, even though I think they would be comfortable. And I have these conversations all the time about why aren't we adding our voice to this? The owner is worried about losing business. He's worried about, if I put my voice out there saying that I don't think we need AR-15s or I don't think we need high capacity magazines, he's worried he'll lose folks that come to his business. The other folks are worried that they'll be disenfranchised or not disenfranchised, wrong word for it, but pushed out of the communities that they belong to. That the folks have done such a strong job on the other side of this conversation. That and kind of painting everybody as one monolith, as one big group. I think they've kind of pushed out the space for reasonable and civil dialogue, where we say, hey, we don't agree with everything that this organization's saying. We don't agree with half the stuff they're saying. We can agree that there's a Second Amendment right. We can agree that we believe that we would like to continue to own the guns, but we can have civil dialogue and conversation about that space. But I think there is a lot of fear for folks as gun owners to step forward and say, hey, I don't agree with the loudest voice in this conversation. I genuinely don't. And that I'm comfortable saying that, and I know it may alienate friends, it may alienate other people that I know, it could alienate family members, but I'm comfortable saying that. I think that's true of a lot of our political dialogue on a number of different topics right now. Right? Are people comfortable alienating folks that they've considered friends to take a bold or brave stance on something? And I think we'll see that conversation again and again and again, whether we're talking race relations, whether we're talking firearms, whether we're talking the haves and the have-nots.
Absolutely. And this is clearly a panel that I wish I could keep much longer, but sadly our time together is coming to an end. If you did submit questions and we didn't get to them, we will address them in the Facebook comments here that will be pinned. So we'll reach out to the panelists too to get their feedback on some specific questions to make sure that we answer them. Thank you so much for joining us today. A huge thank you again to our panelists for being willing to be open and engaged and digging into the hard questions that are facing us right now. Rep. Thompson, Mark, Kayla, thank you for all that you are all doing in your individual, professional, and personal capacities to to educate, to lean into hard conversations, and to make all of us better. To everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. Thank you for your insight, taking the time. Please stay safe out there, and let us at Brady know how we can better support you.
Thanks so much. And thanks that you do all the time. You guys are a great organization.
Thank you.
Thanks for your service also.
Thank you. Likewise, even
The
though you're
both of
Army,
you.
you're